Now I will invite Pamela to ask her first question, please.
Sound.
Hello.
Yummy.
Good to see you all. So as Marcelo said, my name is Pamela, and I'm a PhD student in physical chemistry. And my first question to Professor Denise Alexander is, especially in Brazil, the visions of young Earth are much more accepted in our churches. So, do you believe that this is the case because young view of creation provide a more natural reading of the Bible text and also have an hermeneutical appeal as they deal directly with the text, which does not exactly happen in the evolutionary creation? And also, what can we do to give this theological weight and make evolution equally natural in our churches?
Right. Well, there's two very big questions. So I'll try and keep it reasonably brief. So let's take the first question first. I think the whole idea of young Earth creationism really was exported from the USA to Brazil, I suspect. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my impression. And then you have to ask the question, how did young Earth creationism come to North America? And there's a whole book about it, by the way, by a historian called Ronald Numbers. So Ronald Numbers just died about a year ago, actually. He's a good friend of mine. And he was a very gifted historian. And he came himself from a young Earth creationist background. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. And so he knew young Earth creationism from the inside. And he decided to write a book about the history of creationism. And the book is simply called The Creationists. It's a big fat book, okay, about 500 pages, second edition. And it's a fascinating history, actually. And he points out that young Earth creationism really came to North America quite late. It really came about in 1961 onwards through a book written by Henry Morris and Whitcomb and Morris called The Genesis Flood. And that book, amazingly to many people, it then became very popular and it sold very well. But as Ronald Numbers points out, it was partly a reaction against it was to do with Sputnik, actually. So Sputnik, of course, as you remember, there was a big space race between America and Russia at that time. And so Russia was ahead. So Russia had got Sputnik, the satellite, the first one to go around the world, up in the sky. I can remember seeing it. I was taken in the back garden by my mother to see Sputnik going around. Okay. But that actually created a political crisis in America, and especially concerning the teaching of science in schools. And if you know the system in America, it's that they have local school boards that control the teaching, what goes in the curriculum for that particular school. And so the government started putting a lot of biology and teaching evolution and chemistry and physics. And that created something of a reaction by more conservative Christians in America. Anyway, so Ronald Numbers, the historian, suggests this is partly to do with why young Earth creationism became popular in America from 1961 onwards. Because here in Morris and Whitcomb, they were reading the Genesis text like a scientific textbook. They were actually taking it very literally, and then saying, we can accept this scientifically as well. Actually, Henry Morris was a water engineer. He was not a biologist. But anyway, that's how I think that's a long story, but it's important to see how the cultural and political background, why a particular movement becomes popular. At the time of Charles Darwin, there was no young Earth creationism at the time of Charles Darwin. Everybody knew the world was very old by the time of Charles Darwin. they didn't know how old. Everyone knew from the early part of the 19th century the world was very old, and gradually got older in Darwin's time, but then it got younger again. And the reason it got younger is because of Lord Kelvin, degrees Kelvin, in chemistry and physics. So Lord Kelvin, in the 19th century, calculated the age of the Earth based on the physics known at the time. And that was based on the law of cooling, the law of cooling. And so he calculated the age of the Earth based on the physical law of cooling known to him at that time. And it was getting younger. So the planet was getting younger during the second half of Charles Darwin's life. And that made Charles Darwin rather worried, because Charles Darwin knew you need a lot of time for evolution to occur. And so there was a bit of worry there, if the Earth was getting younger again. Not very young, millions of years, but not billions. And so, okay. And then, of course, Lord Kelvin didn't know about, the radiation, the generation of heat from radioactivity going on in the middle of the Earth. He didn't know about that. And once that was discovered in the late 19th century, early years of the 20th century, then, of course, the Earth became much older again. Okay, so that's a bit of a long story. But I think it's important to know some of the history, because a lot of Christians think that Christians have always believed the Earth is young, based on Genesis. That's simply not true. That's not the case. Like I say, Christians in the 19th century, they knew that the Earth was old. And they also read Augustine, and they read the literal commentary on Genesis, which this wonderful commentary on Genesis written by Augustine in the early part of the 5th century. It was written about 410, 415 AD. And there, Augustine is quite clear in his interpretation of Genesis as a theological text. It's a theological text. It's not telling us about science. He does not interpret it as a scientific text. And neither in the early church fathers, when you look at Origen, or when you look at others, they had different interpretations, some of them, but they interpreted the text in a literary way, as a theological text. So all of that is relevant, I think, to, we should start with the hermeneutics. We should start with what kind of text is Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then we should go on from there, I think. That's where we start, really. And it's quite clear to me the Bible does not tell us anything about the age of the Earth. The Bible is not about that particular topic. And Galileo, of course, knew that. Famously, he said, the Bible tells us not about how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven. Okay, it's a famous saying by Galileo. How to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, it's not about the physics of the planets and, all that kind of thing. It's about God's plan for humankind and his salvation for us, and so on. Okay, that's a bit of a long answer. I'm sorry that's only your first question.